Hey guys, this is Neil. Welcome back to my channel. Today I will be continuing on with the Christmas theme, and I'm going to be combining a few of my previous tutorials to create a Christmas wreath featuring the Poinsettia Flowers from last week's video as the main element, so please go check that video out if you haven't already for a detailed tutorial. Before we start painting the wreath, I'd like to start by creating a circle in the middle of the page. I just looked for a round object which would suit the size and I positioned it in the middle. If you want to make any adjustments, just shift the object slightly, then redraw your circle, then erase the unwanted line afterwards. Once you're happy with the position, we're going to start by painting the main element, which is the Poinsettia Flowers. I have here the exact same color palette that I used in last week's video. So firstly, I start with the lightest tone of red to paint the 5 top petals of the flower, and I like to paint one flower at a time just so I don't miscalculate the actual diameter of the flowers, because it will be larger than just the top petals by itself as we add the bottom layers. I'm using a smaller brush here because the flowers that I'm going to paint are much smaller than what I painted last week, so I just adjust the brush size accordingly. The size of my card closed up is 13 by 13 centimeters, which means it's 26 by 13 centimeters opened up. However, you can make any size that you want, but if you want yours to also be square shaped, just make sure the length and the width are the exact same measurement. I would suggest to go by the round object that you have on hand so you can make the template for the wreath and then adjust the paper size. Here I'm adding darker tones and add on the layers underneath. And for the last layer, I'm going to use some Crimson Lake to darken the red even more, and I'm going to do the same thing for the rest of the flowers. The reason why I like to paint one at a time is so I take my time in deciding the amount and also the positions of the flowers. I always like to start with the focal point and the larger elements, then work down to smaller ones before adding any other, or at least to map out the individual elements, then go back to fill in the empty spaces. I'm just going to do a few of the same flowers, and I want to make the top portion of the wreath larger than the bottom, which is why I'm working on the top area first. However, if you want to paint a full wreath using the same elements which I included, then you can distribute the flowers along any parts of the circle evenly instead of painting the flowers exactly the same as how I'm painting it here. If you're wondering about the details of the color mixes and consistencies that I use to paint these flowers, I do have these information available on the Poinsettia Flowers tutorial that I posted last week. Last week I also painted a larger version of this flower, so it's also a bit easier for you to see what's going on. So I'll just leave you guys to it for the time being, and I'll get back to you once I'm done mapping out the basic shapes of these flowers. Here I decided to add another flower because as I look at the composition of these flowers, the top one is a bit heavy on one side, so I decided to add another small flower on the other side just to balance out the composition. Once I'm done with the basic shapes, what I'm doing here is creating a dark red tone by adding some ultramarine deep into the mix, and I use this to add to the bottom part of the petal on the middle layer, and the darker red should help separate the shapes of the second layer and the first layer, making the lighter red on the top layer stand out a little bit more. Moving on to the leaves of these flowers now, I'm basically painting the same shape as the flowers, but this time I'm a bit more flexible with the placement, and I try to paint them in positions which would enhance the flowers. For the leaves, I'm using three colors, which is Permanent Yellow Deep, Ultramarine Deep, and Sap Green, which I switch up the ratio once in a while. So with one main green color, which is the sap green, and two primary colors, which is the Permanent Yellow Deep and the Ultramarine Deep, I can adjust the temperature and also the value of the greens. After I'm done with these flowers, I'm going to add another large element, and this is an unusual one, but I want to add dehydrated orange slices. I love how deep the orange color is once they're dried, and I think it's one of those scents or flavors that I always associate with Christmas. So to draw the orange slice, I start with a circle, followed with a slightly smaller circle in the middle, and I also want to indicate the midpoint, and then after that I just draw wedge shapes to fill in the space, and I also make sure that the lines in between those wedges are fairly thin. Once you get the idea, you can also try to do this without the initial drawing of the outer line of the wedges, because that's how I'm going to approach them when I paint them. Since I have lots of reds already on my palette, I'm just going to add some Permanent Yellow Deep in one area and mix the two colors together to create an orange tone. I'm going to start with a medium consistency first because I want the base color to be light enough for me to build on top of once they're dried. I start off with a circle, and I'm using the same size brush here because I want the outline of the orange peel to be a touch uneven in terms of the weight of the stroke. And when I have excess paint, I like to puddle them on the side where it touches another object so it can serve as a shadow. Once I'm done, I used a slightly lighter consistency by adding a little bit more water to the mix, and I paint the wedges one by one. I cheated a bit here because before I painted the wedges, I drew a dot lightly in the middle to remind myself where the center of the circle is, because sometimes when you're painting, you don't look at the detail as a whole, and the center point might be a little bit off. When I'm painting the wedges, I also like to leave some negative spaces so it can act as a slight highlight. I'm also going to paint two slices at the top to balance out the composition, and I'm just going to pile them on top of each other so the positioning looks more natural. After I'm done painting the wedges, I always like to clean up the edges, making sure that the midpoint is quite sharp and close together, and the lines in between the wedges are nice and thin. The next element I'm going to add is some small dried leaves from the autumn leaf collection. I love the orange and brown maple leaves, so I'm going to add small ones along the side of the bouquet. You can mix up the colors or just use one. I chose to use either two colors or just one because the leaves are quite small, so I don't want to include too many colors in such a small area. For this, I used more red compared to yellow for the orange, so it's slightly darker. Then I mix in a little bit of ultramarine deep to give the leaves some dark spots. Now I'm going to add another iconic Christmas element, which is holly. And to draw this, it's super simple. It's basically just a leaf shape with pointy curves. You can think of it as a very long hexagon shape, but instead of drawing out lines, you draw out curves for each of the sides. You can also vary this by adding 2 curves on the long sides instead of just 1 curve. And after that, I just like to finish off by adding a line in the middle. For this, I use the same color mixtures as the other leaves, but I tend to go for a darker value, which means I just added more ultramarine deep in my mixes. I'm also going to add red berries in the empty areas, and for the berries I like to paint them using my size 0 brush so the water doesn't puddle up too much and I'm still able to control the shapes. And for the color of the berries I used a mixture of Nephthol Red and Crimson Lake. Then to lighten up the composition, I also added some pine leaves. I find that these are quite important for the composition because so far the elements are quite dark and heavy. They all have a lot of flat colors, so I find that the thin lines of the pine leaves balance out the whole composition. From here on, I've basically placed all the elements that I want to include in the top part of the wreath, so it's time to touch up the composition and add any previous elements that I think would fill the spaces nicely. I'm just going to add the same elements on the bottom wreath so everything is cohesive throughout, and then after I'm done with the base composition, I'm going to add the details and textures of the flowers and the leaves. I think I'm quite happy with the floral elements on the wreath, so now I'm going to add the last layer of this painting just to add a bit more detail. I'm going to firstly work on the orange slices, and for this I mixed a dark orange color and I used it to paint the textures within the dried flesh. And I'm painting it quite sparingly so the bright orange color from the base still peeks through. The strokes that I'm painting here are quite small and I try to always follow the angle and direction of the flesh. You'll notice that some parts of the textures are quite light and in other parts the texture is dark because the paint puddled up. I'm actually okay with this because I like the texture that it gives out, but if you want yours to be neat and more of a tight paint, I suggest you use less water in your mix so the paint doesn't puddle up. Now I'm going to get to the flower and leaf texture. For this, I want to create negative spaces for the spine and the veins of the flowers and the leaves. And again, I do have more detailed explanation on how to do this in my previous video. And this part of the painting does take a long time, which is why I'm going to slightly speed this up. If you're new to watercolors though and you're not comfortable with creating tiny details, I think the wreath itself without the details is quite nice already. You just need to finish up by adding the yellow dots in the middle of the flower, and you can also leave it at that. So please paint along according to your own level and comfort of painting. Anyway, I'm just going to apply this texture for all of the poinsettia flowers and leaves. Then after that, I'll get back to you once we move on to the next step. After I'm done with the texture, I also added a thin line in the middle of all of the leaves, including the holly, where the midrib is, as just a slight shadow to the fold. I'm going to finish off the flower by adding a mix of yellow and white gouache. The reason why I'm using gouache here is so the yellow will be nice and opaque, so it can still be visible on top of the bright red colors. Then after that, I'm going to go ahead and add the branches on the wreath to bring it all together. And for this, I used a mixture of burnt sienna with a tiny bit of ultramarine deep just to darken the brown slightly. And I like to follow the lines that I've already drawn out and continue to make uneven lines and something that's quite jagged to create the branch effect. It's also good to have some parts of the branch slightly sticking out of place to make it a bit more natural. This is an optional step, but I decided to add a little bit of gold border around the top layer of the flower and some parts of the leaf just to add a bit of accent and shimmer. And to do this, I just used my Finetech gold, and I used the gold that isn't too overly yellow. I'm so sorry if I'm not specific on the color. It didn't really come with a color chart when I got this, but I think the golds are quite similar anyway. I just look at the value and see which one would stand against the reds. I also ended up adding gold for the yellow dots in the middle, which I think darkened the yellow a bit too much, so I decided to add a dark burgundy mix to outline the dots just so the gold would be a bit more visible. And lastly, you can write anything in the middle of the wreath. I lost my brush pen, so like before, I just end up using my art liner to write Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. And as you all know, I'm not good at lettering, so I wrote it down with pencil first before outlining. And after I'm done with all that, I also decided to darken the downstrokes so the writing stands out a bit more. And I'm basically done. So here's the finished Christmas card. I quite like how the gold accent is actually quite subtle, that it's not too visible in certain angles, but when the light hits it at the right place, you'll be able to see a slight shimmer, which is a bit different with the glittery effect of the gold leaves, which I ended up using for my poinsettia flowers. Anyway, that's the finished cards. I quite like the combination of the flowers and oranges, and I hope you guys have a great time painting along. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end. I hope you guys learned something new, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!